Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Better Brain Fridays, also known as Friday Facts, Best Care Chats. My name is Lisa Wells, and I'm the Dementia Care Specialist at the Aging and Disability Resource Center. And sponsoring our series is Dove Healthcare, and we have Angela Height with us today. So say hi, Angela. We are in our 12th year of hosting these brain seminars. And if all goes well, we will be back at Dove Healthcare next year in their beautiful community center. So keeping our fingers crossed to be back there next year. So before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. At this time, I have everybody muted. Our presenter today will stop throughout his presentation and ask for questions. And at that time, I'll unlock the unmute. And so you can either chat in the bottom corner of your screen where you can chat in questions, you can chat in comments. Angela will be monitoring the chat box, or you can unmute yourself to ask the question. So I do ask that you just wait until Scott opens it up for that Q&A time. You can choose to have your video on or off, and that's also at the bottom of your screen. There's a little camera symbol there. This is being recorded today, and it will be available on our website. After today's seminar, I will email everybody the PowerPoint presentation, so you'll have that this afternoon. And at this time, I'd like to introduce Scott Webb. He is the Trauma Informed Coordinator with the Wisconsin Department of Health Services out of Madison. And I first heard Scott a couple of months ago on a dementia care specialist, one of our state calls. And this topic is very, very interesting. It was new to me a few years ago, but I've been hearing more and more about it. And I think we're in for a very informative and well-needed presentation today. So Scott, thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation. All right. Excuse me. Well, happy Friday, everybody. And I'm very happy to be a part of this presentation. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I'm fairly late to the party when it comes to trauma-informed care. I've been working in behavioral health for, 35 years. I started off as a clinician working with kids. I've also worked with elders. I've worked with every population. And when I learned about trauma-informed care, maybe 10 years ago, the first thought was, why didn't I know this back in the 1980s when I started my career? Well, it would have been impossible because we didn't know anything about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which I'm going to talk to you about today. And so it wouldn't have happened, but I'm thinking, if I could go back in time magically and back to the 1980s and know what I know now about trauma and adversity in childhood and how that shapes our brains and our lives and how we walk through the world, my goodness, I would have been a completely different therapist. I would have been so much more effective. But we stayed away from trauma. We didn't talk about it. We didn't screen for it. We didn't assess for it. It just was something that we stayed away from. And sadly, even in 2021, when I talk to other clinicians who are practicing still, they say that they still don't really go there. They don't talk about it. A lot of helpers, a lot of clinicians, I think, are even afraid to go there because my thinking is maybe they have a trauma history themselves that when they hear these stories from their clients and from the people they're trying to help, it affects them, it triggers them, it puts them back into that space again where they were as a young person, perhaps. That's a theory, but I know that that's true in my case because the other part of my story is I'm a trauma survivor too. And I grew up in a family with a lot of domestic violence. And my parents did the best they could, but when I hear the stories of what they went through from their parents, and their parents were from, from the Depression, they became parents during the Depression. Different time, different culture, a different way of looking at how you raise kids. So my parents normalized their upbringing as just a strict upbringing, and their dads, both my grandfathers were just very, very strict and violent people. They used physical violence to, have discipline. If I were to give both my parents the ACE questionnaire now, if they were both alive yet, my guess is that they might minimize, but if they were totally honest, they'd have a pretty high ACE score. And if that means nothing to you, it will mean something to you later on. It will mean a tool that we use that can really give us an idea of how our past has affected how our past affects how we walk through the world now. So I look at, I have a lot of passion for trauma-informed care, and it just really convicted me as a therapist because I really think I traumatized some of the clients that I was trying to help, and it was very, very enlightening to hear that. So what I want to do today is talk about, we'll do the welcome and introductions, which we're doing right now. And we're going to talk about the brain because I want to focus more on the brain than I normally do because I know this is a series that looks at the human brain. And I want to talk about the brain and then how adversity in childhood and trauma affects the way the brain is put together, how it's wired. Now, I'm not a neurologist and I don't pretend to be one. And the biggest word I'm probably going to use today is amygdala because I'm a simple guy and I like to use simple terms and in images that really kind of explain what I'm trying to say. But we need to talk about how the brain is affected by trauma and adversity, particularly in childhood, because those children grow up to be adults and elders in our system. And I suspect there are a lot of elderly folks living in their homes or in assisted living or maybe even skilled nursing facilities that are they're wearing a cloak of shame that I call it the cloak of shame that goes back many, many years. And maybe they've never taken that cloak of shame off. And I'll talk more about that as we go along. Want to talk about trauma, what it is, and how it affects the brain. And then we're going to talk about how do you begin to take this information that we have today. And if you accept everything that I say and it makes sense to you, and I certainly hope it does, that we begin thinking about as helpers or volunteers or those working with elders. How could we change our approach? Would it change at all if we had trauma-informed lenses over our eyes where we were looking at that person in a different context, in that we see their behaviors in a different context? That's the hope and intention. That's what I try to do when I travel the state, providing training to usually mostly substance use mental health providers, how to help them become even more effective in the work they do when they're looking at their clients and those that are affected with these issues, looking at them through a trauma-informed lens. And then we'll have some questions, and like was said, Lisa said, we're going to pause during different breaks here, and I'm going to ask for if anyone has any questions. I don't pretend to be the expert, be the end all be all expert on trauma informed care. I'm a fellow traveler. I've just learned a lot about this, and it's really meant a lot to me, and it resonates with me. So hopefully, I can answer your questions, and if I can't, I will certainly find the answers if I can. But I'd like to start all my training with this gentle reminder that we're going to be talking about trauma today. We're going to be talking about abuse kinds of situations. So some of the things I talk about, maybe the video I show, it may bring up something. And I want you to know that you have every right in the world, and I want you to take care of yourself. So I have listed on this screen some things that you can do, some deep breathing or some positive self-talk. Maybe you have to count to 10, or maybe you have to use some fidgets to play with, or you have to do some doodling or drawing. But anything that you need to do to take care of yourself, please, I encourage you to do that because there have been times when I've done this training live, and this is part of a 4-hour training that I do, where I've seen people get up and walk out of the room clearly upset by what we're talking about. And I'm not trying to upset anybody. It's just that the content can be difficult at times. So I just give everyone permission to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. One thing that we know about trauma is that we need each other because the research is pretty clear that healing from traumatic experiences, whether there's significant traumas early in our life or going on right now, or maybe it's both, what heals us from those injuries, from those wounds, is each other because we human beings are relational social beings. We need each other. We need to be in healthy connection with each other. And when we don't have that connection, when that connection has been broken either by abuse or neglect or drug use or whatever, we see what happens to people's lives. We see what happens to their health and well-being. So we need each other. And again, the research is clear that it's not so much the type of therapy that somebody gets to deal with their trauma. It has its place and it works very well, but it's not so much the therapy, it's the quality of the relationship that is established. How safe and trustworthy is that relationship? Because a lot of trauma survivors will say that their biggest thing, their biggest hangup is that they don't feel safe with anyone in any situation and they don't trust anyone. And if you were to hear their story of how they were abused and hurt over and over again, even from when they're children into their adulthood, you can understand why they wouldn't trust anybody if you knew their story. But again, being trauma informed is being aware of that there is a story back there, that we should be trying to understand what that story is. So I want to talk about the human brain very quickly, and it's a remarkable organ. It's made up 3 pounds of massive interwoven nerve cells, 100 billion neurons. I don't know who counted them, but whoever counted them, good for you. But 100 billion neurons are present in our brain. The thing I found interesting, it has the capacity to generate 23 watts of power when we're awake. So there's a lot of electricity going on in there. There's a powerhouse. And the brain will grow 3 times its size in the first year of life. That's important. Keep that in mind when we're talking about adversity in childhood and how that adversity can affect the brain. That first year of life is crucial. And that brain will keep growing until about 18 years of age and not fully mature, excuse me, until that person is between 25 and 27 years old. So that's when the brain is fully formed and fully developed. So the brain is really a remarkable organ. And as we're going to talk about, it's highly susceptible to adversity and trauma, particularly those little young ones, those kiddos early in their life. And each developmental stage of the brain depends on the previous stage. So anything that happens to interrupt that development, again, early on, is going to have long-term, maybe lifelong implications later on. And I'll show you some images of brains that have been affected by neglect and trauma, and you can just literally see the difference. So trauma disrupts the chemistry of the brain and can really push people towards alcohol, drug use, eating disorders, and other behaviors that aren't good for them. And trauma impacts each level of development and the ability to move to the next stage, which I just said. And it can really have those lasting effects. And then we look at aging. Let's just take trauma out of the picture for a minute. Let's look at the natural aging process. And I'm now in my 60s, and I can relate that my brain is definitely different than it was 20 years ago when I thought I was getting old then. Because I'm getting into my 60s now, I'm thinking I can see some cognitive changes in my own. My wife and I are both talking about this. But changes in brain size decline 5% per decade after the age of 40. That explains a lot for me. And changes in vasculature and cognition, memory can also be affected. Now, I know my paternal grandfather had dementia that was vascular related dementia. And he, by my age, when I'm 62, by the time he was 62, he had some advanced dementia already. And he died at 69 and he didn't know anybody. So he died at a very young age, I thought. But that vasculature is also changing. Our memories change. And then the incidence of stroke and white matter lesions and dementia rise with age. So that's taking the trauma piece out of it. And now as we start talking more about trauma and the brain, think about just the normal aging process of the brain and how trauma layered on top of that can really affect how our structure of our brains work. Before we do that, I'm going to move into something called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to play a video that was done by a man named Jamie Redford. Now, if that last name Redford sounds familiar, and I'm talking to a group of people here that probably remember Robert Redford, the actor. And well, his son Jamie, who unfortunately passed away last fall at the age of 56, was a champion about adversity in childhood and trauma. In fact, he made 2 documentaries. One was called Paper Tigers, where he followed a group of kids in an alternative high school in Walla Walla, Washington. And these kids came from very, very dysfunctional, broken families, a lot of trauma, a lot of abuse. And these kids couldn't make it in normal high school, so they go to this alternative high school. That high school had a new principal, Jim Sporleader. He and his team created a new trauma-informed culture. And so that documentary follows these kids through an academic school year and just seeing how they interacted differently with the teachers and how as they faced graduation for some of them, how it was kind of threatening and how they were trying to navigate developing these healthy relationships with another human being for the first time in their life. It's a really cool video. I mean, a really cool documentary. And then Jamie did another one called Resilience. But he created this video I'm going to show you. And it does a really nice job of explaining what the ACE study is. So I'm just going to let the video do the talking, and hopefully you'll be able to hear it okay. I've got it all turned on, so it should work. And then when we tested it with Lisa and I, we tested it all worked. So I'm going to play this video, and then we're going to talk about it.
What does your parents' divorce have to do with your risk for heart disease? If your mother had a drinking problem when you were growing up, are you more likely to suffer from depression as an adult? Here's what you should know about ACEs. ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences, extremely stressful events that can happen to a child growing up. Some experiences are so stressful that they can alter brain development, as well as the immune system, increasing the risk of lifelong health and social problems in adulthood. The term comes from the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, landmark research that shed new light on the root cause of everything from stroke and liver disease to substance abuse and mental illness. In the late 1990s, an epidemiologist from the Centers for Disease Control and a preventive medicine doctor at Kaiser Permanente set out to understand the association between childhood experience and lifelong health. They asked over 17,000 people in the Kaiser Health Plan in San Diego about their health history, as well as difficult questions about their experiences growing up. Anda and Felitti tallied up 10 different kinds of adversity in this largely middle-class and college-educated population. They were stunned to see how common ACEs were. 21% of all respondents were sexually abused as children. 19% grew up with someone who suffered mental illness. 28% had been physically abused. And 2 out of 3 respondents had experienced at least one ACE. The researchers next looked at how someone's ACE score, or the number of adversities they experienced, related to a wide array of serious health and social problems. They saw that the more ACEs someone had, the greater their risk for poor outcomes compared with someone with no ACEs. Someone with an ACE score of 4 had twice the risk of heart disease and cancer. Someone with an ACE score of 5 had an 8 times greater chance of being an alcoholic. And those with an ACE score of 6 or more, on average, died 20 years earlier. With every major problem they looked at in the ACE study, the risk went up for each additional adverse experience in childhood. As Dr. Robert Anda says, what's predictable is preventable. It's important to remember that ACEs are not destiny. ACEs are a tool for understanding the health of a population as a whole. For individuals, an ACE score can be a tool for understanding their own risk for health and social problems, and empower them to make changes for themselves and their children. ACEs tend to get passed down from generation to generation and are common across all income levels, races, and cultures. But increasingly, people of all different professions and backgrounds are coming together to discuss how ACEs affect their communities. They're finding new ways to treat and prevent ACEs. Many doctors are starting to screen their patients for ACEs as part of their medical history. More schools are becoming trauma-informed, considering the source of problem behavior when disciplining their students, instead of immediately suspending or expelling them. To learn more about interrupting the cycle of adversity and improving health and well-being for the next generation, please visit kpjrfilms.co.
All right. So I like that video. It's only 4 minutes and about 5 minutes long, and it's really, it does a great job of explaining what the ACE study is. And One thing that what we've learned from the video and the big takeaways, when I first heard about the ACE study, I was like blown away. And then when I took the ACE questionnaire myself, which is the original version had 10 questions, as I said. And it looks at the first 18 years of your life in your home. And I scored a 5. And I have advanced heart disease. I'm a heart attack survivor. I even shouldn't be here. My doctor said I should have died 5.5 years ago. I had the Widowmaker heart attack, and I was they only have a 6% survival rate. And even then, I didn't connect my ACE score to my own health and well-being. I was a lot more obese than I am now. I was a really big guy, and I wasn't healthy. And I was even doing this training already, and I'm talking to all these people around the state about ACEs and your health, and I'm standing up there really overweight, very unhealthy, and then I almost die of a heart attack. I'm thinking, you need to talk about this, Scott, and share this with other people because you're a living example of what ACEs can do to your health. So I gave one of your handouts is a modified version of the ACE questionnaire. It's actually 14 questions because we're beginning to understand that adversity in childhood isn't just what happens to you in the first 18 years of your life in your home. Like there can be adversities that happen outside of the home, like bullying in school or community violence, being exposed to that. So one thing we've understood from the ACEs study and what shined a light on all of this is that ACEs are really common. It doesn't matter how much money you make, where you come from, which culture, because this study has been replicated all over the world with the same data coming back, that the higher your ACE score, the higher your chances of having health problems. And that was a real eye-opener for me. And when I share this information with other people that have never heard about it before, they tend to be really surprised. And it is passed from one generation to the next. My parents did a better job than what they went through because I've heard their stories. They did a better job, but it still what I witnessed and grew up with is something that no kid should have to deal with. I had an ulcer at 16. I don't know many kids that have peptic ulcers, but I did from all the toxic stress that I was dealing with. And it does have a cumulative effect. You know, the higher your score, the higher your chances. But the big other takeaway is that this is not a destiny. If you were to take that ACE questionnaire and you're totally honest with yourself and you see your score and you go, oh my word, I have an 8 or I have a 6, that does not mean that you're going to die 20 years sooner like the video suggested. Because if you looked at the other side of the sheet that I provided all of you as a handout, there's also a resiliency questionnaire. And the higher your resiliency score, the better off you're going to be. So if you're scoring 3s and 4s on that questionnaire, that's good. If you're going the other way and you've got 1s and 2s, not so good. So you want to be looking at that because resiliency, those relationships in your life that really are important, that have been healthy, that can push back on the power of adversity in childhood. And if you don't have those resiliency factors, then the ACEs can take on a more significant role in your life and can really hurt you and affect your overall health and well-being. So I thought that was a really important discovery. And this study came out in the 90s. What we know is that ACEs have an impact over the lifespan. Yes, it may have happened as a child. If you look on this pyramid, you look at conception, you have your childhood, then you have your social, emotional, cognitive impairments that are related to the trauma and the adversity growing up. And then for those people adopt high risk behaviors. It could be drug use. It could be really violent relationships. It could be a lot of things. And from there, you develop disease, disability, and other social problems, which could lead to early death. But it does affect the whole lifespan. So it can affect you neurologically, the brain, biologically, your overall health, psychologically, socially, and your overall mortality. So it's worth us taking a look at this and saying, ACEs are a big deal. And we should be paying attention to that study because once we as a state or as a nation, when we begin to understand this is a reality, then we begin to move further upstream and find those at-risk kids, those families, identify who have high ACE scores and give them what they need on that, because the earlier we can intervene in somebody's life, the better off that person's going to be. As they move on later in life, the impacts aren't as effective. So we want to catch kids early on and really identify who they are so they don't grow up to be adults and living in our on the streets or in our correction system or becoming dependent on alcohol and drugs. We need to be thinking about how we can intervene earlier, and that's why this is so important. The study is so important. And then I was asked a question one time about ACEs and dementia. Is there a connection? And unfortunately, the research has been very, very hard to find, but there was this article, it's an association between adverse childhood experiences and dementia in older Japanese adults. And the number of people they studied was 17,412, that's a big number. But what they found in this study, and this is just like an abstract, so it's not the whole study, they found that having 3 or more ACEs was associated with increased dementia among older Japanese adults. So what this study really points to is that we need more research. That this is an interesting finding, but we can't like take it to the bank, but it's very highly suggestive that ACEs does play a part in dementia, increased dementia among older adults, at least with the Japanese population. So we need to be looking at this more closely. And I just found that to be a very interesting study because there weren't any others I found out there. This is the only one that I was able to locate. So we have this pair of ACEs. We have the adverse childhood experiences, which is the tree. And this is all the things we were talking about, what the video was talking about. And then we have to let's go underground and talk about the roots, the adverse community experiences, because now we know those two have a really negative effect on our overall health and well-being. If you're living in poverty, with discrimination, community disruption, all the community violence that we've been seeing, poor housing or no housing, lack of opportunity, all these pieces play a part in the ACE picture. And the one good thing that's come out of the ACE study is that we're beginning to understand that first ACE study that Drs. Anda and Felitti came up with was really, really crucial, but we need to build on that. And we need to understand it even more because that's where we're going to be able to make those changes I talked about earlier. So what we know in Wisconsin, we've been doing our own research about, okay, what's our ACE study in the state of Wisconsin? So we've been going out and randomly finding Wisconsinites, and we've been giving them ACE questionnaire, then asking them questions about their own experiences in health and well-being, and we found that 59% of Wisconsin residents have at least one ACE. That's important to know. And when we look at ACEs and mental health in Wisconsin, we see again this relationship between the number of ACEs that you have and the percentage of having anxiety, depression, or frequent mental distress. You see that as you go up the ACE scale, the percentages go up. And if we went beyond 4 ACEs, this bar graph would continue climbing. And again, we could put anything in here. We could put in mental health, cancer, HIV, heart disease like myself, with 4 stents in my heart now keeping me going. All those pieces, we can see these connective tissues between ACEs and these health issues, both mental and physical. Here's physical. Here we're looking at asthma compared to poor general health and obesity. Again, I was a poster child for having 5 ACEs and I was obese. And so I can relate to this and having the poor health outcomes. And we look at types of abuse in Wisconsin. We look and see that emotional abuse is the #1 form of abuse in Wisconsin. That also includes neglect. That would be a part of that. But then we look at physical abuse and sexual abuse. The percentages are much less, but that doesn't in any way talk about how significant this is because those are real people with real lives that have suffered some horrendous things in their life that has affected them in a very negative way. Their overall health and well-being has been affected significantly by this form of abuse. So we see that, we understand that this data is there and it's it mirrors the national data too. And we can't minimize the impact on neglect. Not just physically being hit, but you just being neglected, not having your needs taken care of, can be very harmful to the developing brain. We now know that there are cognitive delays associated with neglect, increased psychological disorders. So these people become clients and consumers in the mental health and substance use world, and they can have stunted physical growth. 8 million children worldwide are growing up in institutions right now, and 75% of child abuse in this country is classified as neglect overall. So it's a big, big issue. We need to be looking at that. So I'm going to just pause to see if there's any questions about the ACEs or anything we've talked about up to this point. You can put your questions into the chat feature.
Yep, and so Angela will monitor that, and I just you can unmute yourself if you would like to ask a question. And I just have just a quick comment as people are thinking, but gosh, Scott, as many times as I've seen this presentation, each time I see it, I learn something new, and it just fascinates me. And it really makes me think about my parents, their growing up, what they experienced, and again, what I experienced. But then I'm so glad that that you also included the resiliency scale. I think that's so important too, and maybe you're going to talk a little bit more about that too, because I think that's important to look at too, that how resilient we are and that we can come back from things.
Yeah, this don't want to focus on the negative all the time. We need to be looking at the silver lining on a very dark cloud, and that resiliency those factors are really, really important, and we're understanding more and more that they're crucial. And building those resiliency factors into our lives, just because we don't have them now doesn't mean we can't build them in now. That's the good news, is that we can continually work on our resiliency and build it up by finding those relationships and those activities that really honor us and build us up rather than tearing us down, because our society is so focused on the negative all the time. We need to be looking at the positives too.
Hey, Scott, that Japanese study, did it talk about if there was a particular type of dementia that they were seeing with the older adults in Japan?
No, I did not. That abstract did not get into that. So I don't know if we're talking about a vascular, Lewy bodies, so whatever we're talking about. I don't know that for sure. But again, I think that study to me was like, we need to be looking at this.
Yeah.
And looking at it very closely, because then we can ask those specific questions. But what type of dementia are we talking about? As we go through this more, maybe it'll make more sense as we talk about how the stress hormones affect the architecture of the brain, and maybe we can come to some conclusions or some ideas, but without that research, we're just guessing. Any other questions? I'm being really clear, huh? Good.
I think you're really getting people to think, hopefully, thinking back of their own childhood, and even grandkids, grandchildren, other family members, friends that you know. Mm-hmm.
I think about my grandkids now, and my oldest is 7, and the youngest is going to be born later this month. So she's not here. She's not here yet. But we have a couple that were born during the pandemic. They're a year old now, and whenever I interact with them, I'm thinking about the still face experiment that was done, where parents were told in this research study to interact with their child while they're being observed, and then turn away and then look back at that child and don't react to the child at all. And within half a minute, the child was crying and stressed out because mom was not giving any type of cues, illustrating how important it is to have that connective serve and return between caregiver. And if you're neglected, if your parents aren't available, or they're busy, or they're on the streets, or they're in jail, prison, that isn't happening. And we know now that that can really affect the way the brain's wired, because that child goes into that toxic stress mode very quickly. So yeah, really important. Well, I guess we'll move on and talk about trauma then. Let's do that. And I am not going to give you a long, boring DSM-5 definition, which is what therapists use to diagnose post-traumatic stress. I'm not going to do that, because I've seen a lot of trainings where they do that, and I don't think that's terribly helpful. So let's talk about what it really is. The Greek word for trauma means wound. So if we start thinking about trauma as an injury, we're not wrong. That's exactly what it is. And we know that there are physical injuries, and we know that there are psychological injuries, wounds. Now, we tend to understand physical wounds a lot more because all of us have had physical wounds. And what is required for that physical wound to heal properly? Time and the proper care. We get that. That makes total sense to us, and we accept it. But psychological wounds are just as real. We can't necessarily see them. We might see manifestations of them in somebody's behavior or how they walk through the world and the decisions they make, but we don't see it. I can show you later, I'm going to show you a PET scan of a 3-year-old child that has brain damage due to trauma, adversity, a wounded, abused brain. What we don't do in our systems of care is we don't often give people enough time to come into a new environment and feel safe and establish rapport with that person and give them the care that they need. We tend to think that we know more than the client because we're the ones with the degrees on the wall, we're the experts, and I'm talking about myself right now, and I'm indicting myself in my own profession because we're not good at this. We tend to think we know more than the client. So we dictate what the treatment plan is going to be, and they got to follow it. And if they don't follow it, they're non-compliant, and they certainly don't want treatment then. That may not be the case at all. But we're not doing a good job of meeting people where they're at if they have a trauma history, because we don't often know they have a trauma history because we don't ask about it because we don't want to go there. But if we were to learn where people are coming from, their stories, what they've shared, and if they felt safe enough and have enough rapport with me to share that story, that's going to change the way I work with that client as a helper. As a former therapist, that would have changed everything. That would have been a much more effective helper and helped that client move to a different level of healing had I known all that instead of staying away from it. So it's a wound. We think of it as an injury. Dr. Judith Herman calls trauma the disease of disconnection. Why would she call it that? Well, one thing that we trauma survivors are good at is kind of being isolated and not feeling connected to anybody, because maybe I feel a lot of shame about what happened to me growing up. And I don't want to tell anybody, because if I tell you my story and you recoil in horror at what happened to me, you're going to think less of me. That's only going to reinforce the shame that I already feel about myself, that I'm worthless. So maybe I keep my story to myself because you're not going to understand. No one's going to understand what happened to me as a kid. I just don't talk about it. And I never did talk about my stuff until very, very recently. I remember my best friend, who I grew up with literally since second grade, just a few years ago, I was telling him some of the stories of what I went through, and he looked at me like, dude, I had no idea you were going through that you had experienced that. Yeah, I did. He had no idea because I covered it up. So we trauma survivors are good at covering it up and going the other and not talking about it, but that just cuts us off from the human race. And we need connection. Remember what I said at the beginning of the training? How we heal from trauma is by being in these healthy relationships with other people. Trauma is extreme stress. We know that. It's like a threat to life, bodily integrity, sanity. And it's more about the reaction to the event than the event itself. So what I mean is that all of us right now could experience the same traumatic incident, and we would have vastly different responses to that event based on who we are, our own experiences, what we've been through before, how we're wired. It's going to be very different. So it's very subjective. We can't assume just because I don't think that's a traumatic event that you would not respond that it is, because I'm not you. Trauma lives in the body. And I can't tell you how many stories I've heard when I've done my live training before the pandemic, where I've had yoga instructors validate this, but I've heard stories of people that take up yoga for the first time. And it's a very healthy thing to do, and everyone should try to do something like that. It's good for you, it's good for your flexibility. A lot of good reasons why yoga is great, especially for trauma survivors. However, I've heard so many stories of people that take up yoga for the first time, and when they're doing these yoga poses, they begin to weep uncontrollably. They just start crying and sobbing. And the yoga instructors often don't know what's going on. They've seen it, but they're not sure what's going on, and they don't know what to say to their student. And I've had yoga instructors tell me in my training that they've seen this themselves and that's happened. So that is something that is definitely a reality. So trauma lives in the body. It lives in the cells. And when you're doing these yoga poses, or if you're going for deep tissue massage, or if you have acupuncture, if you're a trauma survivor and you've been carrying all this toxicity in your body for so long, it may come out in really powerful emotions, and that is very, very normal. So I just say that in case it sounds familiar, or if you've ever heard anybody who went through that. Trauma interferes with relationships. Again, if I grew up witnessing domestic violence like I did, what are the chances that I'm going to grow into adulthood and marry the person of my dreams and live happily ever after? I'm going to really struggle with that, because I don't know what it's like to be in a healthy relationship with another human being. My teachers, my role models, were at war with each other. So it makes sense that I'm going to probably recreate that in other relationships as I get older. And then people around me might be looking at me going, why is Scott continually getting hooked up with these really dysfunctional people? What's going on with that? What is his problem? Well, that's a non-trauma informed way of looking at it. A trauma-informed way of looking at it would be, what's going on in Scott's life where this is what he continues to choose to have these type of relationships? What's the story behind that? That, my friends, is a trauma-informed shift in thinking. So it interferes with relationships. We have these chaotic relationships. We don't know how to connect. We need to be taught how to be in healthy relationship. And maybe that's somebody who's even in their elder years. We need to teach them what it's like to be in healthy relationship. It affects our beliefs about ourselves and others. You know, we have this trauma worldview that we have, and I'll talk more about that later. We know that trauma is a lot more common than you think, and its effects from early life can follow you throughout your life into your elder years. And then we look at elder-specific traumatic experiences. Let's just take all that maybe what have happened early on in our life. Let's layer on that the traumatic realities of getting older, a loss of our spouse or our friends. I remember my grandfather, when he was near the end of his life, he was looking out the window depressed. My grandma had died like many years before, and he just like, Scott, why am I still here? I should be in the boneyard. All my friends and family are gone. You know, my peers, my brothers and sisters are gone. Why am I still here? So that loss of spouse and peers is significant. Chronic life-threatening diagnoses. Our health begins to decline. We have physiological changes, limitations. We have cognitive and memory loss, which again, a normal part of the aging process, but now as we talked about, it may also be connected to trauma and adversity. Increased, loss of roles and resources. Maybe, in our society especially, we attach so much meaning to the work we do. I mean, just go to a party somewhere and they'll say, well, what do you do for a living? Back when we were working, what do you do for a living? What did you do for a living? We attach a lot of meaning to that, and when we lose that, when we move into retirement, or what I like to call Renaissance, the Renaissance period of our life, we have to redefine who we are. We have to figure out our purpose, separate from the work that we did, and then we become more dependent on other people to take care of us. So the question I would ask you then is, how does having a trauma history compound these later in life traumas? And if you have any ideas, you could certainly pop them into the chat. But I think it's a good question to think about. All that we've talked about so far, then you layer on the traumas, the elder-specific traumas. How does having that history compound these later in life traumas? Have we ever thought of that? I'm guessing we probably haven't. So we shouldn't be surprised if we see some elders that are really, really struggling for a lot of reasons. And if we look at it through that trauma-informed lens, hopefully we can give these people some grace and step back and go, how can I be more effective as a helper, knowing what I know now about this? So one thing to keep in mind when considering how often older adults face new traumas, any change, and in the previous slide, there's a lot of change here, right? There's a lot of change going on with this slide, changes in people's lives, and they're normal. Any change involves loss. And all loss needs to be grieved. And how often do we allow space and time for people, especially elders, allow them to grieve? I think all of us have become very accustomed to grieving in the last 16, 17 months with the pandemic, because many of us have lost. We've lost maybe jobs, we've lost our loved ones, we've lost relationships. My relationship with my grandson and my granddaughter, who were born 3 days apart, is not what it was with my other grandkids, because they hardly know me. We just went to their first birthday parties. My granddaughter won't even let me hold her because she's terrified of me. And my grandson, he's kind of like stranger danger too. He's not as, but it hurts. It hurts your heart to think we could have had a different relationship, but we had to be away. We weren't around him. So that loss needs to be grieved, and all of us should be very familiar with grief at this point. And many factors make it more or less difficult for elders to, before, after traumatic events. Again, we talked about these. The impaired cognition, mobility, decreased social networks, limited finances. All these will make it more or less difficult for elders after a traumatic event. So we need to be mindful of all the things that could be playing into this person's life that could be making it difficult for them right now to navigate life to the best of their ability. Hopefully that makes sense. So trauma disrupts our brains. How does it do that? Well, a person experiences a traumatic event and their brain would react to that event as a very serious danger. So they go into fight or flight or freeze, which is where the body begins, your body goes into this red alert, and your body goes through 1,400 different changes very, very quickly. So this person experiences trauma. Their brain and body become overwhelmed with very powerful chemicals like cortisol, adrenaline, other chemicals, norepinephrine, and that body and the brain just get flooded with all these hormones. And maybe they don't know how to get themselves back to baseline, how to get themselves calmed down. So they reach for alcohol, drugs, relationships that are very violent. They find ways to distract from dealing in a healthy, effective way the trauma that's going on. No one's ever given them some tools in their toolbox to help them kind of calm down in a healthy way. So they find quickest ways: cigarettes, alcohol, drugs, whatever. If the trauma goes untreated, the person gets stuck in that stress response mode because the brain actually begins to wire itself to look for danger. My brain is definitely like that. To this day, I still have some post-traumatic stress hangover from my childhood. I have to sleep at night with earplugs in because I'm constantly scanning my environment. I'm not sure what I'm scanning for, but I can't calm down unless I can't hear anything. That's a holdover from my childhood. Certain things still trigger me. Slamming doors, loud voices, a lot of arguing and yelling will trigger me. I have a plan how to deal with it that's healthy now, but earlier on in my life, I didn't. So we get stuck in that mode. And maybe those cues continue to trigger us, like loud noises, smells, textures, and we don't, again, have a way to calm down. So we're in fight, flight, or freeze all the time. So that person kind of reacts to trauma, living in a perpetual state of fear and terror. And they're always distracting themselves from that, feeling fearful and terrified, by drugs, alcohol, relationships, other things to distract themselves from what's going on. It all goes back to being kids again. We have positive stress. There's different types of stress responses. Positive stress is where it's a normal, essential part of healthy development. Like a kid getting a vaccine or their first day of school, they have this peak of adrenaline. They get kind of worked up, but over time they begin to, very quickly, they can return to baseline because maybe they have a lot of really good, loving adults around them to help them deal with that anxiety of the first day of school or the vaccine or whatever. So that's good. That's a good thing. Well, then we have tolerable stress, where this is a more severe type of stressor, like loss of a loved one. Maybe a grandparent dies, or a mom or dad, or they get a broken bone. They have to take a ride in the ambulance. Really scary. So they have that spike in adrenaline and cortisol. But again, if they have healthy, well-adjusted adults around them who are calm, they can help calm this child down, and they return to baseline. And then we have toxic stress, where you're experiencing strong, frequent, prolonged adversity like physical, emotional abuse, or constant exposure to violence. This was my childhood. I spent most of my time in fight, flight, or freeze. I was going to school with my brain not in a place where I could learn. I was held back in third grade because I was not able to learn. But these children don't have healthy, well-adjusted, loving adults around them necessarily who are calm themselves. So they're not able to calm down either. So they never learned how to do that. So they're living in this constant state of fight, flight, or freeze. And that affects our brains. And I like looking at the triune brain, and I use Dan Siegel's hand model. If you can see me, I'm going to use my hand as a model to explain the brain. You never thought your hand could be the brain, but it is. And we have the reptilian brain, the green part. That's the first part of the brain that develops in utero. So we call it the downstairs brain. Sometimes people call it the lizard brain. But it's the reptilian brain that deals with instinct and survival. And that would be my wrist and my forearm. Okay, that's the primitive part of the brain. The limbic system would be the yellow part that deals with emotions. And that's my thumb across my palm. And that's where trauma is going to hit the reptilian brain and the limbic system. And then we have the neocortex, the blue part. That's the last part of the brain that gets developed. And that deals with our speech, logic, and higher thinking skills. It's what separates us from every other animal on the planet. Now, when we're in fight, flight, or freeze, what happens? The neocortex goes offline. In fact, Dr. Siegel says we flip our lid. So we're left with the reptilian brain and the limbic brain driving the bus. They're in control because the neocortex is saying, you know what? You're in danger mode right now. You're in red alert. You don't need me. In other words, we were designed not to appreciate the beauty of a tiger while we're running from it. We're in a different spot. We are in battle stations. We're going to run. We're going to fight this threat, hunker down, but we're not in a place to think logically about anything. And a lot of people go through their life with the reptilian brain and the limbic brain driving the bus. And those people have a real hard time relating to other people. They have a real hard time. Here's a PET scan of a healthy brain and an abused brain. The healthy brain on the left shows a 3-year-old child, and you see all the red and yellow activity. That's good. This is a 3-year-old that is in a very loving, stable environment. Their parents, their caregivers are constantly meeting their needs and giving them what they need. So this is what we want to see in a 3-year-old's brain. The brain on the right is an abused brain. This is the brain of a 3-year-old Romanian orphan. And if you ever heard about the Romanian orphanages, it's a sad place. They're institutions where kids are just put into a big room with other kids, and the adults, there's no loving, there's no serve and return going on, there's no connecting with these children in a loving, consistent way. So the brain and look is very dark. The only part that's really lit up is the amygdala. And that's the smoke detector in our brain. This is the part of the brain that looks for danger and will react if it perceives something as dangerous. It turns on the alert system. That part of the brain is really lit up, right? So what we have here is a brain of a child that has been wired to look for danger. They're not looking for nurturing, they're looking for danger, and they're going to be very reactive to anything that would be perceived as a threat. If this child was in our schools, they would be highly reactive, they would be maybe have impulse problems, violent outbursts, inability to connect with any human being in a meaningful way. And the school may not be trauma informed, and they look at the behavior and they think, oh, we have ADHD, or oh, oppositional defiant disorder, or oh, intermittent explosive disorder. All these buzzwords start flying around when in fact maybe what we're dealing with is a brain that looks like this. And this child will grow up into an adult with deficits, a brain wired for danger. Mine is sort of like that, maybe not to this extent. And they're going to always be in a one down position because the brain's never going to look like this again. There's some promising research around neurofeedback where kids are given these probes put on their scalp that measure brain waves, and they're taught to manipulate an image on a computer screen by using their brain waves. Like, make the rocket ship fly faster, Johnny. And they learn to do that, and they've discovered that after 40 neurofeedback sessions that the brain begins to rewire a little bit because a young brain is very elastic. Neuroplasticity is the fancy word for it, but it's a real thing. And that these kiddos can actually gain a lot back by doing these neurofeedback sessions, or even mindfulness, where they're taught to be in the moment. And schools are beginning to do more and more of that, which is really cool to see. But again, these kids grow up to be adults and are elders, and they may have these deficits that have never, ever been recognized. And we look at the actual gray matter of a 3-year-old, a normal 3-year-old on the left, and a 3-year-old that has suffered extreme neglect. You can see the actual brain volume is smaller in a 3-year-old child. Not just the neurons that you saw, but the brain itself is smaller. And that's sad. That's from neglect. So neglect cannot be made light of. Toxic stress changes the brain, the way the neurons are wired. You see a normal neuron here on the top, all these little branches, typical neuron, all the connections. And then you see a toxic stress, what's going on there with that. And you see the density is much less. There's fewer branches. So this is what toxic stress, cortisol, and some of those powerful chemicals can do to the brain. And the limbic brain is really important because it's the emotional part of the brain. It processes a sense of smell, and a lot of times the sense of smell is what triggers a lot of people for trauma. Like let's say you're a child and you were abused in your grandfather's moldy, musty basement. You were sexually abused. And you grow up into adulthood and you've never dealt with it, and you walk into a clinic for the first time for some mental health services, and the place smells like a moldy basement. That could trigger you into a serious post-traumatic stress episode. And you may not even understand why, because the sense of smell is so powerful, it goes right to the limbic brain. But it's also the center of bonding and connectiveness. So the limbic brain is extremely important. And that gets affected by trauma the most significantly. It gets inflamed. And it's in women, it's actually the limbic brain's larger in women than in men, so they really become more liable, there's more susceptibility to the injury of the limbic brain in them because they have a bigger volume of the limbic system than we do, than men. Which makes them more susceptible to depression and other imbalances. So we want to be mindful, if we're being trauma informed, those things that might trigger somebody. Are we ever going to get it right every time? No. But just being aware, if we're accepting everything we've talked about today as being true, and we want to be mindful of those things that we may do inadvertently or obvious that could trigger somebody's limbic brain where they go into fight, flight, or freeze. And it could be this isn't an exhaustive list here, folks. It's just some examples. And maybe you can think about situations where with an elder, like being isolated, if they're in isolation, that could be a trigger for them, or authority figures, or being told what to do. All these things could be a trauma trigger. And being trauma informed as an organization is having this knowledge and having tools and the awareness that we are looking at these elders through that trauma informed lens. And there's a trauma worldview I talked about at the very beginning. If you were to peel away the layers of somebody and really look at the essence of what they believe, they would say something like, no place is safe. Other people are unsafe. They can't be trusted because everybody that ever said they had my best interests in mind have hurt me badly. So I don't trust anybody. So you tell me that you want to help me, I'm not buying it. You're gonna have to work really hard to earn my trust. My own actions, my own thoughts, my own feelings are unsafe. I expect crisis, danger, and loss because that has been the story of my life. That's been my life script from little on. I might be in my 70s or 80s now, and I'm still operating off that life script. I have no worth and no abilities. That's the cloak of shame I was talking about before that we have. So I just want to pause there if there are any questions about the trauma piece before we talk about being trauma informed. See if there's any questions.
So Carol said, I want to emphasize that it is never too late to get the tools you need to deal with trauma-induced triggers and live a better life. As other sessions have taught, our brains still have neuroplasticity.
They do, and I don't want to leave that. I don't want people to think it's just kiddos. I'm just saying that neuroplasticity is much more a thing as we're younger. But yes, that Carol's point is valid. That it's never too late, and that we can definitely help people. And I just think about my mom had a massive stroke when she was 64, and she lived 3.5 more years before she died. And she couldn't talk. She had aphasia, attacks. She had everything. She couldn't move her right side. It was a bad one. And she didn't know anybody at the beginning, but I noticed that by the time she passed away, glimpses of my mom that before the stroke were coming through, and she was much more alert. And that would be evidence of the fact that neuroplasticity is still valid, and the brain can rewire even in later in life. So that's a really good point. It's a really good point, Carol. Thank you for bringing that up. Any other questions?
I just have a quick comment as people are, again, feel free to chat or you can unmute yourself. But I just realized something when you said something today here about the sense of smell, how powerful that is. And I didn't realize that is the sense of smell is something that definitely, having some trauma, but it definitely triggers, some tough things, but also good things. I can smell fresh cut grass and I think right away, oh, I think of my dad. Or, I smell some bread, or, the smell is so incredibly powerful. And I guess I didn't really, I always know, maybe I've always known that, but I just didn't realize that for me, that's definitely triggering for certain things.
Yeah, and I have a story about that that's kind of interesting. And I did a training a while back at the Wisconsin Resource Center, and the people, the clients that are there, the patients are in corrections. So they have committed crimes they've been found guilty of, and they are serving a sentence, and they go to the Resource Center for mental health and substance use treatment. So you get some pretty big, violent people in there, big guys in there. And I went into their sensory room that they've created because they're working at becoming trauma informed, and they were teaching these patients, inmate patients, how to self-soothe. And I heard one story about one big burly guy came in with the biker tattoos and all that, and he came in and they introduced him to some essential oils, and they wanted him to try smelling some different, and he's like, you want me to smell this stuff, really? So he did it. He went along with it, and he told them, he says, when I came in here, I was really ticked off today. He used a different word, but I'm going to make it safe for work. I was really ticked off when I walked in here, but ever since I did that smelling thing, I feel a lot better. I don't know what you did, but that was good. So he was introduced to the fact that essential oils like lavender or some other have a real calming effect. And so it can be a trigger, but it can also be a way to ground as well and get yourself back to baseline. And it's something that most people aren't even aware of.
Can you talk a little bit about self-soothing, because I think that's a term that feels more recent to me. And, maybe I've, haven't thought I've done things to self-soothe, but I didn't really call it self-soothe. So maybe could you talk a little bit about what that is and what that could look like?
Yeah, I'll tell another story, if that's okay. When I was working in the EAP, before I did this job, I was an employee assistance program person. So I had a client come in for an emergency appointment, and she was really upset. I could tell on the phone. She wanted to see me like immediately. So long story short, she came into my office and she clearly had been crying. Her chin was going up and down. She was shredding a tissue and she was extremely agitated. I could tell just by looking at her, she was in fight, flight, or freeze. So before we did anything, I had her sit down. I reached into my drawer. I gave her a stress ball, but it was shaped as a human brain, kind of a cute little thing. Gave it to her and told her to take that and start squeezing it. And then I taught her to do some diaphragmatic breathing, which is just taking some deep breaths where your belly goes out, really, really deep breaths, getting it down the bottom of your lungs and let it out. And I had her do that 2 or 3 times while she's doing the ball. And I could see her begin to calm down because I knew she was in fight, flight, or freeze. I already had this awareness about trauma-informed stuff, so I knew what was going on. And I didn't even ask her what was going on. I didn't want to know until she was at baseline again because I was talking to the limbic brain. So just by doing deep breathing and doing the stress ball, she was able to come back down. Now we can talk about why you're here. So she started talking and then she got agitated again. I stopped the conversation again, had her do the stress ball and the breathing. We did that 3 times in an hour. But when she left, I gave her the stress ball to keep, which she carried with her the rest of the time I was working there. She said, I still have my stress ball. I have your brain. That's cool. But I gave her 2 tools for her toolbox she didn't have before. And when she walked out of my office, she said, oh, by the way, I didn't tell you this, but I was sexually abused as a child. And I was thinking to myself, I kind of had a feeling there was something there because her reaction to the thing that got her so upset was way out of proportion to what it would normally be. But for her, it was significant. And it was significant because of her past. So what I'm saying is grounding techniques can look like a lot of different things to self-soothe. You can teach people to rub their hands briskly together, really get some heat going, and put it on the back of your neck, or on your forehead, or on your face, or just feeling your feet on the ground, just being grounded and doing some deep breathing. Or you could do some more deliberate breathing, like what I call 4-7-8, where you breathe in for a count of 4, you hold your breath for a count of 7, then you exhale for a count of 8. You can do that, like do 2 or 3 cycles of that. That helps me go to sleep at night if I'm having a hard time sleeping. That's what I fall back to. And it usually works because you're mindfully breathing and you're paying attention to your breath where you're not then distracted by all these other things that are going on in your brain. You're focusing on one thing. That's a form of mindfulness. So you can teach yourself to do that. There's a lot of things. You can go on the internet and find all kinds of ways to ground yourself. You can put hand lotion on. That can be a real soothing thing. Drawing, using coloring books. I've done a lot of training around the state where I've seen people coloring mandalas, which are very elaborate illustrations. They bring their own markers. This is particularly when I was training indigenous people on the reservations. They bring them in because they're very familiar with trauma. And they knew that they're going to get triggered probably in that training. So they would color. They were paying attention, but they were staying grounded by doing this coloring activity. So there's a lot of ways you can ground and self-soothe that don't reach, and it's not reaching for alcohol or some drug or a cigarette. That's the quick thing we always think about, but it doesn't, that hurts. It doesn't help. Hopefully that was instructional.
Was there another question? I think somebody was going to ask a question and
I just had a question and a comment. Um, I My name is Stephen Bircher. I'm a functional neurologist and I do neurofeedback in my office in Eau Claire.
Oh,
And
awesome.
been doing it for probably 10 years. And we do brain maps also. They're not exactly the same brain maps that you had there, but they're similar. And we've had a lot of good experiences with it. And we use essential oils and it's just something I just wanted to comment with. We've been doing it for a long time and had good results with it.
That's awesome. You're way ahead of the game, Stephen. Bessel van der Kolk would be very happy to hear that. I know that he's a very psychiatrist who's really been trying to get more funding for neurofeedback because there's so much potential there, and I think it could become a real serious evidence-based practice for dealing with trauma. So that's great you're doing that. That's very cool. All right, I'm going to move on now. Now let's just kind of, we've talked about ACEs, we've talked about trauma. I think we talked about how trauma can manifest with the elderly population, how that there's a compounding effect perhaps. Hopefully that knowledge would convict you to think, well, what can we do about this? What does being trauma informed look like? Because that would be the next step, the logical extension to what we've talked about already. And what we need to do, Dr. Hodis is the guy that Gordon Hodis came up with this. He says that we really need to presume that the clients we work with, or patients, or students, or whatever word you want to use, we just assume they have a history of traumatic stress and exercise universal precautions by being trauma informed. In other words, you treat everyone as if they have a ACE score of 10 or 14 or whatever, and just treat them that way with kindness, compassion, love, acceptance, and no judgments. If we do that with everybody, we'd be in such a better place with our systems of care. Unfortunately, especially the medical model is not really set up that way. It's more about, it's very illness focused, very deficit focused, and it can be traumatizing. And so we really need to be thinking that if we just treat everyone as if they have a high ACE score, we're never going to be wrong. It's going to feel good whether I have a trauma history or not. If you're going to treat me with love, acceptance, and unconditional positive regard and all those good things, that's going to feel good. And if I'm a trauma survivor, I may not trust that early on. I may test you, but deep down, it feels good and I need it. I may not know how much I need it, but I need it. So that's really important to have that, keep that in mind. So the overarching concept would be that trauma should be seen as the expectation, not the exception. But when we're dealing with anything, whether we're schools, behavioral health, whatever. So being trauma informed really moves away from the medical model about what's wrong with you. And that's an area that we're very comfortable in that space. I know when I go to the doctor, it's like, well, where does it hurt? What are the symptoms? When I was a therapist, I did my psychosocial assessment, trying to figure out what's wrong, what are the symptoms, so I can make a diagnosis. So we're comfortable with that, what's wrong with you, the deficit-focused, illness-focused thing. Trauma-informed care moves into something where we talk about what happened to you. Now, you may not ask that question overtly, you might, but really what I'm talking about here is that you create an environment and an interaction experience where that person's coming in, they feel safe, they feel protected, we're establishing rapport, I want to know you as a human being, and then maybe then I create the environment where you'll feel safe enough to share with me your story, if you have one. And the research would indicate that over 90% of people that are in behavioral health as a client have had a significant trauma history, over 90%. So that's almost everybody. So it's a matter of, am I doing my job in developing a relationship with you where you can share that with me? Because that's really going to be crucial information for me as a helper when I'm trying to form a treatment plan or a wellness plan with you, because then I know your whole story. And I did my whole career as a therapist early on, missing a major part of my client's history because I never asked. It wasn't part of my questionnaire. And that needs to change. We need to be screening and assessing for trauma. And then moving beyond that to what's right with you. We don't want to just stop with what happened to you in your story, because I'm more than my trauma. I'm a human being. There's good things going on in my life, even though I may appear very broken and quote unquote dysfunctional. There's a lot more right with me than is wrong with me, because I'm still here. I'm surviving the best I can. So what we need to be doing with these folks is listening for those times when we can celebrate with them their victories, or even asking them, what is one thing you're most proud of in your life? Because a lot of trauma survivors, I can assure you, have never been asked that question because we're so focused on what's wrong with you. So we need to be looking at what's right with you, and then capturing those moments and giving them back to that person, and paying them. It's not just it's not just paying them a compliment. It's noticing their purpose, noticing their strengths, what makes them who they are, bearing witness to that and giving it back to them and saying, I see you, I understand you. That's called empathy. That's connecting in a way that's going to be very helpful for that trauma survivor. And then we talk about the 6 key principles of a trauma-informed approach. Any organization that wants to change their culture, they need to really look at all 6 of these. Safety, to me, being the number one, the biggest one. But safety, psychological, physical safety, what does that look like, sound like, feel like in the work that you do with the clients you work with? How can you appear more trustworthy and more transparent in your work? How can you engage peers? How can you collaborate with these folks and not be the expert, but recognize they have expertise too, and empowering them by giving them a voice, a say in what's going on in their life, and giving them some choices, and being aware of the cultural, historical, gender issues. When you begin to lean into these 6 principles and begin to bake those into your day-to-day, then you begin making that shift more trauma-informed, trauma-responsive. In Wisconsin, back in 2009, we had an advisory group, and we created what we thought were the big guiding principles for trauma-informed care. And the biggest one being relationships, which I talked about before. But we could spend an entire day talking about any of these, promoting safety, earning trust, diversity. We could really talk about all of these and spend a lot of time on what that should look like in our work. And then back in 2017, Dr. Murthy, who's our Surgeon General, he was also the Surgeon General under Obama. He was at a conference and he said that the oldest medicine in the world is love and compassion. And I just love that quote. And Twitter blew up with this quote. He was at a conference in Seattle. It just blew up everywhere. And I thought, I've got to include that in my training because that's exactly what I'm talking about. Love and compassion is the oldest medicine in the world. And Dr. Murthy gets it. That's pretty cool. So what is trauma-informed care? It's really what we've been talking about. It acknowledges that trauma is very pervasive. It's everywhere. And it focuses on how trauma may affect a person's life and how they respond to services or not. If somebody's really resistant to getting help, we don't want to judge that and say, well, what's your problem? Why? We're trying to help you. What is your problem? It's more like, okay, what's going on in that person's life where they really find it difficult to trust anybody to even engage in services that may be helpful to them. It's about creating safety for everybody because, again, becoming trauma-informed isn't just for what we do with the client or the elder, it's what we do with each other. If we're working in an organization, it's about using those same 6 principles I showed earlier across the entire organization. So leadership is practicing those with their staff, the safety, the trustworthiness, the transparency, all that. It's a parallel process. That becomes a very cool work environment when you do that and you do it well. I've been in those places around the state that have done the work, and the vibe just feels very different. It's very, very interesting to see people happy, healthy, engaged, and look forward to coming to work because they know the organization is going to support them and recognizes the hard work they're doing, and they celebrate successes. So it's all very, very, very good. But it's creating all that collaboration and trust. Those are the things I talked about before. We do what we can to avoid re-traumatizing somebody. They've been hurt enough. So anything we can do to lessen re-traumatizing somebody, the better off we're all going to be. And we appreciate that the behaviors we're seeing as problematic are just their abilities of trying to cope, get through life. And we strive to give them choices for the survivor and control over their healing. We're being culturally competent and strength-based. It's not an intervention to address post-traumatic stress. A lot of times people think trauma-informed care is like a type of counseling we do or some type of procedure. There are different types of counseling, like trauma-based cognitive behavioral therapy or EMDR, which is with the eyes, the bilateral moving your eyes back and forth. They're not sure really how that works yet, but it does work with post-traumatic stress. But those types of interventions work well in a trauma-informed culture. But it's not, trauma-informed care is not a type of treatment. And it's not flavor of the day. I think we're at the point now where we've been talking about this for almost 20 years. So this isn't going to fade away. This isn't a fad. I've had people tell me that. They think it's just a fad, a flavor of the day. We're going to move on to something else. And I always tell them, well, if treating people with care, compassion, love, and empathy is flavor of the day, what does that mean about our state of our profession? Doesn't that indict us that we're not doing all we should be doing? That we've settled for something less than what we could be? And it's not age limited. And that's really trauma-informed practice. That culture can be implemented anywhere with any population at any time. And there's different interventions that we do. There's the top-down, bottom-up approach, looking back at our triune brain. A lot of therapists will treat trauma from a top-down approach where they really start at the neocortex and they work their way down, and that is not helpful because people, if they don't have grounding skills, they're just going to get triggered and it's going to be really, really difficult. And the primary focus of therapy is really that top-down, where we start there. And we talk about thinking. What's wrong with your thinking? How do we fix it? Now, I was a cognitive behavioral therapist, so I did this. I never did the bottom up. I did the top down, and I had varying success with it. Now I know why it wasn't as helpful as it could have been. Because the bottom-up intervention is different because we're going to start with the reptilian brain and work our way up. You must recognize and soothe your feelings first. We need to teach people how to ground and self-soothe. Give them tools in their toolbox before we get into the higher brain stuff of therapy and other things we expect from them. That makes sense to me. We need to, that's like that lady in the EAP who I met with. I started with her downstairs brain, with her reptilian brain. We did breathing and we did the stress ball. We're not talking about what's going on. I'm not going into the neocortex. We need to deal with the downstairs brain at that point. So what does that look like? Top-down types of regulation would be journaling, mindfulness, reflection, healthy boundaries, gratitude practices. These are all really good. But I don't think we should be starting there with people who have a trauma history, because that's the neocortex being engaged first, moving down into the reptilian. Much rather go the other way, bottom up, breathing, grounding, having calming spaces, exercise and movement, music. Those are the kinds of things that are going to be helpful in that lower brain and giving them the tools to self-soothe so they can be better equipped to handle it when they get triggered. If they do get into the upstairs brain stuff and they get triggered, they'll have some tools they can use to bring themselves back to baseline rather than just getting hijacked emotionally and running away, which a lot of my clients would just leave treatment. And now I know why, because I was doing top down when I should have been doing bottom up. Hopefully that makes sense. So looking at these two models here, we're kind of getting close to time here. Looking at these two models, the traditional model looking at an elder, what's wrong with you? We have an elder that's not fitting in well, has limited social skills, not making friends, they're isolating, and then they're not remembering anything. So there's all the focus on what's wrong with this person. Contrast that to a trauma-informed approach. The what happened to you? We start asking questions like, has this person experienced a significant loss or a transition recently? Is there a medical condition, medication interactions, a trauma history? Not just taking that behavior and looking at that and labeling it and judging it, but trying to understand it and asking these key questions. That would be a trauma-informed approach. So we want to use compassionate communication. So one thing we can do is we get rid of these dehumanizing languages that we tend to use. And I've used all of them at one time or another in my career as a therapist. Sadly, I did this. I'm indicting myself. But saying, so-and-so's just manipulative, or they're non-compliant, they're attention-seeking, or they're a loner, combative. Those are words that aren't helpful. They're dehumanizing. So how do we change that? Manipulative, I could say that person's creatively trying to get their needs met. I'm not lying, and that feels better than saying they're manipulative or non-compliant. Maybe there's a reason why they're non-compliant. If we don't know their story, we don't know. Re-traumatizing somebody is just any situation or an attitude that we have, or an interaction or an environment that replicates somebody's original trauma. We may not know what that is unless we know their story. The moldy basement or Old Spice cologne could be a trigger, a negative one, or it could be a soothing one, as to Lisa's point. But again, re-traumatizing somebody can be obvious or it can be very subtle. It's usually unintentional because I think all of us on here, we care about people. That's why we're here today. We want to be helpful. So I don't think we're intentionally trying to hurt anybody, but I know I did it a lot as a therapist, just based on ignorance. It's always hurtful. And when we label people, we judge them. This is something that was really important that jumped out at me because Brene Brown is somebody who's very, very wise, and she's kind of like a modern day philosopher. And she said that we human beings love to judge if we're totally honest with each other. We kind of like to judge people. Maybe it makes us feel better, more superior. I don't know. But she's right. And when we judge people, we lose the ability. When we label them, we judge them. And when we judge, we lose the ability to connect with them. If I think that Joe over there is just a combative old SOB, I'm not moved to connect with Joe. I think he's a pain in the butt. So I'm not going to connect with him because that's just who he is. That's not a trauma-informed response. Again, it's like what's happened in Joe's life where he is responding to people in this manner. What's going on? What's happened? What's happened to him? So that's when we have that connection. We can keep that connection because if I'm judging somebody, I'm not going to connect. So creating safety is really important. Have that environment that's welcoming, maintain respectful physical and emotional boundaries with people, and asking permission to draw closer to them if you need to. having a safe place, a quiet place, a confidential place to talk if you're having a private conversation. Be open to outside parties, advocacy, clinical consultants to come in and help. Ask about current abuse and address current risks to safety. Here's a brief trauma screen that my friend Gabriella Grant gave me permission to use. She came up with this in working with elders. It can be very simple. It doesn't have to be elaborate. Asking an elder, do you feel safe speaking to me today? That's giving them voice and choice. That's one of the values of trauma-informed care. If not, what would help make you feel safer? Again, giving them permission to share and taking their lead. Do you feel safe at home today? If not, how can we help you feel safer? Or did you feel safe at home as a child? If not, how does that affect you today? Those are questions that are very interesting. And you might get some interesting feedback from them. That's just a brief trauma screen that you can do doesn't take long. But if you ask these questions and give them time and space to respond, you're going to learn maybe a lot about that person. So responding to people in need, active listening is really, really important. Validating their experience, because that's really important, because we have a lot of shame about what our experiences have been, and it's not our fault. It's not our fault that we were treated the way we were treated. And it's very hard to share, and it's hard to just letting somebody know that's really a hard story to hear. I'm so sorry you went through that. Normalizing their experience. A lot of times, both my parents, they normalized their abuse, the abuse that they received by their parents is just strict upbringing. And they laugh about the fact that my grandfather would sit across the dinner table at night with a leather strap across his lap because he was a barber and he used to use to sharpen his straight edge. He'd sit every night at dinner with that across his lap, waiting for an opportunity to use it to whoop somebody, because children should be seen and not heard. And they laughed about that. I remember going to family gatherings, they talk about that and laugh, and I'm thinking, that's messed up. To get beaten when you come together as a family to enjoy a meal and you have this cloud of impending violence hanging over the table, but they normalize that as okay. But we need to normalize their experiences and assist them as we can with grounding techniques or making appropriate referrals. And again, doing what we can to avoid re-traumatizing people, knowing that we're not going to get it right every time, but we're trying. And here's some more examples of what validation looks like. Some things you can use. You'll have the PowerPoints, you can have these to look at. But we need to broaden our view of trauma-informed care, because one thing, when I first took this job at DHS in 2014, there was still a lot of silos. I was getting requests for me to go out and do training for TIC for kids, TIC for elders, TIC for, and it really is the same conversation. It doesn't matter what age group we're talking about. ACEs are ACEs. It's just that the person maybe is an elder, but they had the same experiences that a lot of kids are having today. But we need to be thinking about trauma-informed care across the entire age span. And all the concepts that we talk about apply to all ages, like person-centered planning, compassionate communication, confidentiality, comfort. All these things are really important. And it's for all ages, not just for kids, for adolescents, adults, elders, for everybody. So I have some things hyperlinked here that you can take a look at. Some adult protective service, aging staff interventions. Look at that. Some mental health first aid for seniors seeking safety, which is a really good program. So there's some things here to take a look at. So kind of putting a wrap on this, and then we'll take some final questions. In a nutshell, be attentive. The language that you use matters very much so, because your words have tremendous power. You can build somebody up with your words, you can tear them down. Use speech that's free from labels, jargon, and judgments. That's going to get you in a much better place in connecting with somebody. So I wonder if there's any last questions that people have before we close. I also have some contact information. If you don't have questions now, you can email me. Also, I have a listserv that it's a monthly collection of the latest training and webinars and articles related to ACEs and trauma-informed care. If you want to sign up, you can just go to the Resilient Wisconsin website and you can sign up to get my email. I sent it off to about, I think there's like 15,700 people now, and it's actually become international because I had a psychiatric nurse from Australia reach out to me recently thanking me for the content. So we've gone international when it was supposed to be just for Wisconsin, but people like it. So if you want to sign up for it, you can go to that site and do that. Any last questions?
Scott, can you tell me, is trauma-informed care, is this being are people getting informed in faith communities, clinics,
Yes, that
schools?
is. It,
I
it
mean,
is. Yeah, it is. And in fact, I'm taking a couple days off in September, and I'm presenting at a faith community conference in Illinois. I'm going off the grid. I'm doing it on my own. So I've been asked to do some training for some churches around Madison occasionally. I've done that on my own time. So that is happening. I'm seeing more articles about that out there. In schools, definitely. I know that in Wisconsin, there's been some grant money going up north, and there's going to be a lot of training up in the way up north with school personnel on Dr. Bruce Perry's neurosequential model of trauma informed care. So that's very cool. La Crosse is doing a lot of work on creating a trauma-informed community, and they're now working with a consortium around Madison, with 8 counties around Madison, to create trauma-informed communities. So they're going to be key stakeholders in all those projects. There's going to be not just the schools, but it's not just going to be behavioral health. It's going to be everybody. It's going to be a part of this initiative. So that's very cool. And I'm hoping we can get them part of the Resilient Wisconsin initiative and make that more of a statewide thing. So it is happening. It's not happening fast enough. There's a lot of training going on, but not enough transformation. And we need to be working on having a model, and La Crosse is a really good model in how to create trauma-informed communities. And they're about 3 or 4 years into it, and they're making some good progress. So it's happening.
oh, there's some questions in the chat box. Angela, do you want to bring those up?
Yeah, so 2 of them are just are comments. Very powerful presentation, great information, matches my experiences. But the question is, I'm confused, thought normalization of dysfunction was wrong and also a good practice. How does that work?
So normalizing would be when you hear somebody's story and you would say to them, you give them reality. Like one time I had a guy tell me once, he came up to me during break, he's like, yeah, my old man beat me till he saw blood, but I was a pain in the butt kid. I had it coming. And I just said, can I give you some feedback, my friend? This is normalizing. I said, you have normalized that as being okay, but it's not okay to be treated that way. To be beaten till you see blood, speaking from experience, that is abuse. And that's going to leave a mark. Whether you want to acknowledge that or not, my friend, that does have an impact in how you are put together and your experiences. So normalizing is pointing out that abuse is abuse, what it looks like. And it makes sense that you behave a certain way based on what you're telling me. It makes sense that you would behave the way that you do. I get it. In fact, if I had that experience, I'd probably be doing the same thing, maybe even worse. So that is normalizing in a proper way. You're not going to normalize dysfunctional behavior. You're going to call for what it is. It's abuse, and it's not okay. Because back then they normalized it as being okay. That's what everybody did. Well, now we know a lot more about trauma. We know a lot more about what trauma does to the brain, and that explains then maybe some of the behaviors we're seeing in people. So I get the question, but yeah, normalizing, and maybe I need to explain that a little more clearly, but we need to call for what it is in a gentle way, but then giving them hope and saying that you don't have to stay in this space. You can move beyond that. You can move beyond that, and you can learn about it, and you can learn different ways of dealing with people, dealing with life that don't involve hurting yourself or somebody else.
Well, thank you, Scott.
She said, okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a great question. Thank you for helping me clarify that.
Thank you so much for this powerful presentation today, and I hope that for our participants that maybe this was something that was new, that they'd never heard about this before. And like you said, this is all ages. It's information for everybody and anybody. So such good and powerful information today. Thank you so much, Scott, for this presentation.
Oh, you're very welcome. And if anyone has any questions, you can email me. Lisa has the PowerPoint, so feel free to check out the resources. And again, hit me up with any questions that may occur to you afterwards.
And if you haven't registered for our next Better Brain Fridays coming up on Friday, July 23rd, we have a little bit more lighthearted and fun presentation with Moira Kinnear, who is a retired chaplain, author, and speaker. And her topic will be joy, happiness, and brain health. So something we definitely all need right now as well. So if you haven't registered, please do at adrcevents.org. And until then, have a wonderful weekend. And thank you again for participating today. And thanks again, Scott. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Take
Thank
care.
you, Scott.